lecture. This evening we are very glad to have Professor Laurent Stalder from Zurich, Switzerland, to give us a very interesting lecture we are expecting. The title is In Search of Autonomy, Swiss Architecture 1970 to 2000. Professor Laurent Stalder has been professor at the Institute for the History and the Theory of Architecture, we call GETA, ETH Zurich, since 2006. From 2017 to 2021, he was working as a director of the institute. Before that, in 2009, he was a visiting scholar at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And he also collaborated with professors from Japan. He was once as a guest professor for architectural behaviorology at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. The main focus of his research and publications is the history and the theory of architecture from 19th to the 21st century, where it interests with the history of technology and of culture. His most recent publications including several books. The newest, maybe the Arrow, is the newest, very interesting book, yeah. So I don't want to speak more. Professor Stalder actually now is our old friend, but many times here. The lecture will be very, very tense and interesting. I think very important for us to have really a Swiss scholar to explain why Swiss architecture emerged from 1970s. Welcome, Professor Laurent Stalder.
Thank you for Professor Liu for this nice introduction and also for inviting me here to Shanghai. It's always a pleasure to be here and to be especially with you here. I would like also to thank your Dean, Professor Yuan, for having me, hosting me, and exchanging since many years together. I would like also to thank Professor Wang for making this all possible, and Professor Liu, who accepted to respond to my talk. I hope it will be clear enough that the response will be it will allow us to have a debate. The topic which was given to me forced me to make a double framework. The first framework is that I was asked to speak about Swiss architecture, and the second about recent architecture. And I think this is important that first we begin somehow to settle down the framework of the speech before beginning and digging into the topic. Indeed, the first question, what is Swiss architecture, actually is quite a complicated question. Can architecture have a national identity? Is Swiss in architecture because it's using Swiss materials, because it has specific characteristics, because it is built by Swiss people, or simply because it is located in Switzerland? Of course, this question applies to any nation, but it seems that in the case of Switzerland, it's particularly difficult and thorny to resolve. Indeed, the Swiss identity has been constructed for quite some time by others, by Englishmen, by Frenchmen. And so when you look at somehow the first attempt to define what Swiss architecture is in the 19th century, for instance, in the work of the famous architectural critic John Ruskin, he would say, as there is no uniform Swiss geography, there is no uniform Swiss character, and therefore there is no uniform Swiss architecture. So somehow he was dismissing that we could even speak somehow of a specific Swiss architecture. And similarly, and you have to remind the early 19th century is the beginning of the constitution of the Swiss nation as we know it today. 1950, 5 years after the Second World War, Kidder Smith, American, comes to Switzerland and compares it somehow to the American continent to describe somehow the diversity that in Switzerland you have all the different geographies that in a polemical way he would attribute to the American continent. You have Alps, you have lakes, you have flat lands, and you have pre-Alps. And it seems somehow that these problems in identifying what a Swiss architecture could be would continue till the most recent years. For instance, in these two bridges by Jörg Gonzet, the Swiss engineers, one in wood, as you can see, and one in stone. And the argument he gives to it that one bridge is closer to the Swiss-German tradition, who has a wood tradition, while the other one, using stone somehow, is more related to the southern part of Switzerland, where the landscape is much stonier and where somehow the houses have been built for centuries in stone. And what is interesting somehow is that this logic that John Ruskin, Kidder Smith, and Jörg Gonzet construct seems to be a logic where building materials, topography, and specific traditions are very closely interlinked. So they are not arguing somehow out of a stylistic characterization, but much more out of a structural. Somehow there are therefore two main options, one could say, or two main traditions that has been constructed. The one is to refer simply to the mountain as the common ground somehow of the Swiss landscape, but perhaps also as the Swiss imaginary. As you can see here, these are the scaffolding for the Swiss village at the 1900 exhibition in Paris. So you see again the alpine landscape as the main feature. The houses are very small, the landscape is very big. Or even here in Shanghai, when the Swiss presented themselves, they presented themselves somehow as an alpine landscape over the big cityscape of Shanghai in 2010. Perhaps some of you can remember riding on this Swiss telepheric. The other option, and this is an option that was presented some years earlier, 1992, by an artist, Ben. La Suisse n'existe pas, Switzerland doesn't exist. And of course, the right-wing politicians were not happy about this definition. A Swiss pavilion, and the main phrase on the pavilion is Switzerland doesn't exist. But what Ben wanted to say somehow is the same that Kidder Smith or Ruskin were trying to provide, saying there is not such thing as a Swiss identity. We have to construct it again and again and again in different ways. And the way, and that's where I come to the time frame, and the way we construct somehow this identity or this Swiss identity can change from epoch to epoch. So in the 19th century, it was perhaps more the local materials and construction that were of interest to the architects and historians. In the 1970s, it was the capacity of the Swiss infrastructure to gain energy and to build up to the highest point in the Alps, like in this project by Justus da Hinden. And perhaps, and we are going to speak about it from the 1970s, we will discover somehow that the engagement with the topography will be of critical importance in the redefinition of Swiss architecture. Now, the second point, the first point was very much about the Swiss time frame. The second point is about this 1970s that for many reasons seems to be a good starting point for history of the most recent past. Why? Because the 1970s show a deep transformation and political changes in the field of architecture. As you can see, the rapid urbanization of the countryside and uncontrolled urbanization, a growing importance of technology, especially through dam buildings and highways, which will deeply transform the Swiss landscape. But also, and perhaps this is more tacit, a growing importance of norms and regulation within the Swiss building practice, where somehow the conditions of the architect are completely changing. And related to this growing of norms, also a growing power of general contractors. The relation between architects and their clients will completely change through this legal changes, because the general contractors will have much more power in the transformation and in the engagement with the building. So at this very moment in the 1970s, a growing importance arises among architects somehow to redefine their field, to define what is at stake, what can the architects do, what is the tradition of architecture, and how can we have a new agency within this difficult political and cultural landscape, where technology, where urbanization, where norms, where general contractors become more and more important. The 1970s is, for a talk, also a particularly good moment, because it's also one of the last moments where Switzerland works as an isolated country. There are very, very few foreign architects that built in Switzerland before the 1970s, and beginning with the 80s, and especially beginning with the opening of Switzerland to Europe, there will be a growing competition between foreign architects and Swiss architects within the territory. And finally, the last good point to begin with the 1970s, that in the 1970s, a competition is launched that reunites architects from 7 regions. So they don't ask individual competitors to compete, but they ask different teams from different regions to compete. So you have people from the north, from the east, from the south, and from the west. And the competition is an important one, at least for Switzerland, which is a very small country. So it's about the creation of a new campus for the Swiss Institute of Technology, not ours, but that of our friends in the French-speaking parts. So they were distributed throughout the traditional city of Lausanne at the Lake of Geneva, a beautiful lake with the Alps here. And they get this new site to reunite the Polytechnical School and the university. And now let's go into the architecture and look at the different projects. And if you look at the majority of the project, you will see that it's about proposing a megastructure which can be expandable in different direction. So the university is conceived as a site of production. It's not a site of production of goods or of machines but it's a site of production of knowledge, and it has to adapt to the changing needs of knowledge. And this is what you see in the majority of the project. So you see with the arrows a campus that can expand in different directions. This is by the group from Zurich, or here the group Soler by Fritz Haller and others, which conceives the university as a communication network. So you have the different faculties, and depending on the way you do research, so for instance, if you have a certain topic which goes through different faculties, let's say invention of new digital structures. So you would have the architects, you would have the engineers, you had the computer faculty. Perhaps you will have also the mathematical faculty who could somehow reorganize the campus and transform it into one unit where somehow you would have digital architecture, or if you are interested in history, for instance, you would have perhaps the archives, and you would have the historians, and perhaps the preservationists, which are perhaps also the building technology, which are linked together to achieve a certain goal. So here also the university is not something stable, but somehow here the way you do research and you communicate between the faculty is different. And if you look at the project by Mario Botta and others from the southern part of Switzerland, it seems that you have similarly a mega structure, a big structure which can indeed also expand. You could expand the housing, you could expand the communication lines, you could expand the laboratories, and so on. And indeed, it seems that the Botta scheme is very much linked to similar project of the time, the hospital by Le Corbusier for Venice, where Mario Botta was studying at the time. Also with an open structure, with repetition, which can adapt to the building site, or similarly, just to take another project, the Freie Universität Berlin by the firm Candelis, Josic & Woods, also a megastructure, that somehow is a superposition of the free spaces, the communication spaces, or the different functional units. But this is one way to see it. Another way to see it, and I think this is what makes this project so important for the time, that architecture is not only conceived as a problem of organization or of production, but as a problem of form. And this you might see perhaps most clearly also at the level of the object as at the level of the territory. At the level of the object, you have a clear recognizable shape. So the shape, the borders of the unit is clearly defined. First, they build a triangle, then they build an edge, and with the growing necessities of the university, you will somehow close this shape. So it's not an expandable structure which can go over the territory, but it's a clear formal decision. First, horizontal and a vertical line which structures the territory. Secondly, an infill of the corner. Then from the corner, an infill of the field, which acts as the level of the object, a very clear defined object, and at the level of the territory, because the object somehow relates. This edge relates with this edge, forming clearly defined spaces. So in the Botta and Ticino project, it was mostly drawn by Mario Botta, but it was a much bigger group. We have a very clear movement or change between an understanding of architecture as an organizational problem to architecture as a problem of form. And this is visible in the following project and competition of these groups. I brought you urban projects like these by Mario Botta and Luigi Snozzi for the railway station of Zurich. The neighborhood is the neighborhood of the 19th century on both sides. The train station has been expanded throughout from the 19th century to the 20th century till this edge. And what the architects do somehow, they begin to clarify the relation between the field of the railway and the city by building a clear edge which transforms an infrastructural space into a formal, clearly defined entrance gate of the train station. Similarly, at the level of the object, one can find a similar engagement both with the architectural object and the territory, as you can see here in this little house by Mario Botta in a completely urbanized neighborhood. So you see that all these little houses have been built in the course of the 1950s and 60s, where there was a vineyard before. And somehow, in a first step, Mario Botta distances himself from this neighborhood by placing a volume along the edge, closed to the neighboring houses, and also trying to avoid any relation to the highway, which is running here through this valley. And in a second step, then, again, opens the building to clearly conceive it as a machine for seeing, like a camera, a machine for seeing. You see somehow the analogy between these buildings and a photographic camera, by opening somehow the villa only to the points in the territory that are worth seeing. So the house becomes a completely segregated field for the small family, with a few openings which either show to the vineyard that you have here, or to the mountain. Unfortunately, we don't see it, but here you have a beautiful mountain with snow in the winter. And the second important step, so on the one step somehow is engagement on the territory by underlying the direction of the slope, by underlying the topography, by underlying also the important spots in this territory. And on the other level, a deep engagement with local typologies that you can see somehow in the studying and using of formal motifs that you could find in the vernacular architecture. On a more abstract level, a similar approach can be shown in the work of Luigi Snozzi. Very simple houses using a kind of archetype built up of pillars, walls, ceilings, and floor. A very simple house. Again, a house that very clearly engages with the topography by being on the one side underlying through different walls the topography, on the other hand by being clearly perpendicular to the topography, but also in the interior conceiving the house again as a viewing machine. So from the back of this room, you have a framing of these islands, and the more you advance in these in the house, the smaller the island becomes. And yesterday in your project, we saw a similar movement. You can frame with two pillars a very nice landscape or an object, but if you go closer to the window, the landscape then opens up and the island becomes part of the panorama. So here again also the house is conceived as a machine of viewing. He uses somehow the elements to stage very clearly the landscape and the beautiful untouched part of the landscape. In all this project, there seems to be a very close relationship to what was happening in Italy some years earlier, especially in the work of Aldo Rossi. I brought here the Quartiere San Rocco because somehow it shows that certain questions that we have seen in the EPFL scheme, in the university scheme, are similarly traced in this project. An interest of a very clear underlining of the edges of the new structures, a spatial relation to the existing views, and an understanding also of the historical typologies like the block. However, Aldo Rossi is a complex figure, and we will see somehow that beside the very proper analytical approach of his work, one can also see as the very creative and imaginative dimension of this work in his Città Analoga, where you see again the scheme of the housing that I just showed before. So here you have the housing, you see it. Here you have this imaginary project, and you don't know if this is a ground plan or is an elevation. Similarly here, you have, is it a window or is it a castle? And that's where we see somehow these double approaches of Aldo Rossi, the analytical approach, the typological and morphological approach on the one side, and the analogical approach, where by putting a shape in a specific situation, it gains a new meaning. You will see why I'm opening somehow these two approaches, the analytical approach and the analogical approach. Indeed, it's not clear completely. There are competing visions that will act in the architecture of that time, and I want to show you two positions on two projects which were done for this castle. It's a castle in the valley of southern Switzerland. It's a medieval castle built on a hill with the city around it, and the castle was built to protect and to close somehow the valley in case of attacks from the north. The aim of this competition was to renovate and make this project public. This is the first, one of the first entry by Bruno Reichlin and Fabio Reinhardt. What do? They undig all the historical traces of the building and then put a new gallery in metal as a new layer. So their work is first an analytical work by working like an archaeologist, showing the different traces, and then transforming this archaeological site into a museum by putting a new gallery, by adding somehow a layer, and by adding this layer somehow giving a new signification to the site. You see it here very well, the gallery which is exposed and is laid over the project. This project was not realized. A second competition was launched a few years later with a completely different understanding of the relation to the historical site. Two main interventions are proposed by Aurelio Galfetti. The first intervention is to build a communication between the historical city and the square. So he introduced an elevator and a staircase which connects these two layers, the public square of the city and now the public square of the castle, from where you could then walk on the walls along the valley and observe the valley. And the second important thing he does, he cuts all the tree from the rock. So transforming the rock into a shape. So suddenly the rock is not, or the hill is not just a hill with trees like the other hills of the valley, so the other hills that you can see here, which are full of trees, but it's completely ripped of any trees, somehow forming a big volume that engages with the valley at the level of the territory. So we see somehow that on the one side there is a very pragmatic approach. On the other side, we see that the interests about the relation of architecture to the territory somehow finds its application here in such a project. Second, around 1985, so the first was 1970 to 1985. We could call it In Search of Autonomy. This could be a kind of way. When I speak about autonomy, it's somehow the belief of the architect that architecture is a discipline and that architects follow certain rules, like geometry, like construction, like formal analogies. We spoke about the southern part of Switzerland. Now we have a move somehow to the northern part of Switzerland, especially in my school at the Swiss Institute of Technology, where somehow the discourse will be extremely intense in the 1970s in the teaching and will have a big effect in the 1980s. So the rupture that I want to propose here is not a completely radical one. Because why is it not a radical one? Because a lot of teachers from the southern part of Europe will come to teach to Zurich. So Luigi Snozzi, again, who built the little house, will do a studio in Zurich at the ETH with the students. And he would, you see, he would study this kind of, he proposed this kind of student project. And similarly, Bruno Reichlin and Fabio Reinhardt, the two who had built the castle before, will teach at ETH, will be the assistant of Aldo Rossi at ETH at this very moment. So the transition is a smooth one. We have somehow the protagonist from the south now teaching at the biggest university in Switzerland, at ETH, and somehow having to engage with a completely new context. And I think this is very interesting in this discussion. Already at this, or at this time, the shifts will be very precisely described by an architect, Marcel Meile, when trying to reflect somehow what was happening between the 70s and the 1980s. And I think it's worth somehow to dig a little bit longer into that. He will say, we heard Aldo Rossi. Aldo Rossi was important for us, but we had to understand how we could translate it. So it's not enough somehow to take over the lesson of Aldo Rossi. We have to translate it into the Swiss context. For instance, he says, Switzerland has no long building history. So Aldo Rossi could rely on Palladio. He could rely on Alberti, on Michelangelo maybe. But we in Switzerland somehow do not have this heritage. So we cannot work in the typological manner. You know, if you look at this house, this is a plan of Palladio. So the southern people would say, we just take Palladio and revisit Palladio and adapt Palladio because he has developed a scheme which is ideal for housing. The Switzerland will say, no, we don't have we don't have any big architecture, so we have to rely on everyday architecture. Our model are the farmhouses, are the industrial buildings, are the highways, are the infrastructures that have been built throughout the last 100 years. And this is what we are going to engage with. And the second important shift, he will say, what is at stake is less the question of typology, because there is not such thing as typology, but that of atmosphere. And from this discussion, and you can see it very nicely in the drawings of Aldo Rossi, where the question of atmosphere was already there, this question of atmosphere will become more and more important in the teaching and in the design of the students. So away from abstraction and geometry to materials, texture, construction, and colors, from history to everyday life, from typological approach to a visible approach, and from the ground plan to the perspective. These are the important shifts that will happen at the time. And the economic situation was very bad in the 1980s, or relatively bad in the 1980s. And so the young students would have to compete in competition somehow. And so most of the contribution would be drawings, like this one, that, as you can see, does not deal anymore with the big shapes of the classical architecture, but is interested in the power lines or in the materials, in the shades of the building. And indeed, more and more, and especially in these projects, what is at stake is the question of atmosphere. And atmosphere is a very ambiguous term, because atmosphere, if we speak strictly about it, is a gas which surrounds a body. Somehow atmosphere begins where construction ends. It concerns that which emanates, in the real sense of that term, from the surface of a building, its color, light, odor, scents, temperature, and humidity. Schick and his students, Schick was an important teacher, and his students would therefore say, we are interested in the dirt on the road and on the heat of the asphalt in summer. So how can we express somehow this everyday object and the everyday atmosphere that we all know? We know how it smells when we go home. We know how it smells when we go into a garden. We know how it is to walk on a hot street. And how can we as an architect somehow engage with us? So it's a much deeper and more sensitive dimension that is introduced. And even Peter Zumthor, whom you might know, will say, I have to design everything. The people, the air, the noises, the tones, the colors, the materials, the presence, the textures, the forms too. So somehow the field of engagement of the architect will broaden enormously. And therefore also the importance of the drawing, because on the one side it was used as a very important analytical tool to analyze a situation, to analyze a precise setting. So it was the possibility somehow to think about the wall, to think about the elements, but also through the new building to create a new ensemble. So it's both an analytical tool and the tool to design. Drawing becomes an important tool of analysis and of design. They would sketch and see and analyze the landscape, the everyday landscape, the everyday life of the people, and then somehow transform this analysis into a big representation. But to think about architecture in images is also to think very much about the surface of the building. At this time, many different approaches and solutions will be given. In the work of Zorkirchen and Marquez, it is the everyday objects of a building which are at stake. You can see somehow that the concrete wall, which was mandatory in Switzerland in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as everybody had to have a bunker in its own house. So somehow we built in concrete not only for a structural reason, but also for so-called security reason, but also the pilotis of Le Corbusier, you can see here. So the structural element is shown, but also the case window becomes an object of design. The ventilation shaft becomes an object of design, but also the little chimneys, which are not simply put on the roof, but somehow which structure the surface of the roof. Are certain, like Miroslav Schick, begin to play also with this everyday object, contrasting, for instance, the vertical windows towards the street. These are the typical European windows that you have on the street side. They are vertical and relatively small. And on the courtyard, he has then big windows that completely opens towards the quiet space. Others deal more with construction or experiment with construction and the vocabulary of different construction types. The beams that are colored in a different colors than the walls that are where planked are used, or prefabricate or glued elements here for the vertical parts, and through these materials somehow they articulate the plan. You see the entrance, the walls or the roofs have different types or use a different vocabulary from the beams, the planks, up to the wall panels in wood. Somehow the construction becomes a tool of distinguishing different parts of the building. Others, like Herzog and de Meuron, will more play with the shapes and the materials that they found in everyday life, but by, for instance, using very cheap concrete bricks, but then painting them in blue or shifting the window from the main axis, or perhaps more importantly, by using everyday materials from the building site, like these asphalt elements, to protect simply wood construction. On the urban scale, a similar approach will be chosen by Roger Diener. And if you remember, Roger Diener was the architect who asked Luigi Snozzi to build him a villa. So you see how close the personal... Switzerland is super small, so everybody knows everybody. And I think this is also important to know. So Luigi Snozzi was the teacher of Roger Diener. Roger Diener was coming from a good family, so he could build his own house. He commissioned Luigi Snozzi to do it. But here, an early project from the 1980s. As you can see, he tries to integrate these new buildings into a historical ensemble with the medieval wall of Basel on one side, and on the other side, somehow the houses, the medieval houses with their very small and vertical structure. We'll come back to this later. And you see how he adapts each facade to the specific site, specific context of the site. On the back side, where there are more industrial buildings, he uses wood planks. Where there was a little industries with a paper mill, he would use the structure of the industrial buildings. And towards the square, he uses this more closed facade with opening as holes. But at the same time, and this is interesting, and then the same versatility, or one could say even postmodern liberties that he has, he shows it similarly in the plans, where he uses completely different ways. He uses a Corbusian pilotis construction towards the square, where here somehow he uses a series of 4 walls to structure his building, while here he uses a frame constructions towards the canal. So it's not only at the, and I think here we see very nicely how this engagement with the image has very much also a constructive soul at its core. It will be once again, and you will see that once again, sometimes you need people who are able to formulate things. It's Jacques Herzog who, during an exhibition, will try somehow to summarize the main characteristics of the time, and he will bring in the notion of collage. And collage is an important notion because it shows a shift from an interest in the shape towards the construction of the fragments. So the image is not purely a formal problem, but it becomes a constructive problem. And you can see it very nicely in this exhibition, where they overlay on the windows their own project, but you can see still the historic city, which is behind the windows, thus overlapping these two elements. You have the Frei studio and you have the roof of the medieval city of Zurich, somehow, that are brought together and whose edge somehow begins to be the real challenges of the architect. And this you can see, this interest for construction becomes even more clear in the work of Peter Zumthor, like this chapel San Benedetto from the 1980s, from the late 1980s, where somehow the grammar of the signs that we could have seen in the work of Aldo Rossi under postmodernism shifts to a grammar of construction, where the question is now less about the different signs which comes together, but about how the different elements of architecture, the pillar, the window, the roof, the wall, the floor, the furniture, are brought together. And it seems that somehow this was possible because at this very moment different traditions come together. Still a very good tradition of handcraft. I think this is crucial to understand it. Polytechnical education. So in Switzerland there is no, or there was no Beaux-Arts school training, but the training happens in the polytechnical schools, which is an advantage for certain things, which is but also a disadvantage for others. And I guess also a political support with high investments in the field of architecture. In the 2000s, again, a certain shifts happens that I will call now natural history. In 2002, there was an important exhibition at the Centre Canadien d'Architecture in Montreal, where the work of Herzog de Meuron was shown for the first time, or for the second time, to an international public, and in which they decided, on the one side, to show their architecture. You can see different architectural projects, but also different materials they were using at the time. But to combine these materials, these models, different stages and stages of development of models, but to combine their own architecture on the one side with the collection of the Centre Canadien d'Architecture. You can see here a color book, you can see an egg, but there were also other samples that was brought, entomological samples, toils, fossils, and so on. But to combine it with a series of artworks, you can see Donald Judd's artworks. There were also artwork by Gerhard Richter, Andy Warhol, photographs by Bernd and Hilda Becher, or paintings by Helmut Federle. So a wide range of objects were laid down in this museum: architectural object, finished project, project in different stages, materials from the project, but also materials from the collection of the museum, and important artworks and photographs from contemporary students. And when you read it, and it was called natural history, and indeed you can conceive it as exhibition like you would perhaps see in a museum of natural history, where you have different objects of organism from different geographical contexts and from different time. But what is interesting is that in this museum, the objects were not organized, let's say, by races, or by times, or by classes, or by regions. So these are the classical categories that you would put in a history of natural history museums, but by the different states through human action. And this is very important. They define different actions that man and the humans can have on materials and in shaping these materials. So the categories are now transformation and alienation, appropriation and modification, piling and compression, impression, and molding. So the objects here are not anymore the result of a cultural history or a cultural historical narrative with its significance, but the objects and the architecture objects are part of a materialistic history rather than a cultural history. What is at stake is not the historical moment of their becoming. Is it 2000 before Christ, 2 million before Christ, but somehow the state of transformation which is at stake. And this theoretical approach, or this approach which had been somehow systematized or at least sketched in this exhibition, would find a rather successful realization in practice. On a formal level, perhaps, first, like in this Depot Ricola by Herzog de Meuron from the 1980s already, in an old quarry, where the layering of the work within the quarry is repeated in the layering of the facade, or in the work of Valerio Olgiati, where there is a very interesting play, and there you see that Olgiati is also a pupil of the analog school. So somehow that these breaks that I've introduced are artificial breaks, of course. So on the one side, you see how he plays with the slope of the terrain that he repeats in the roof. If you look at the section, the slope of the roof and the slope of the terrain are exactly the same. But at the same time, it's a classical roof, a roof with a slope. So what is it? Is it engaging with the traditional house, or is it engaging with the terrain and the formation of the terrain? So this is the formal analogy that I would give, but I go, or in this case also of Devanteri and Laminière, or Gigon Unguyo, where the pouring of the material somehow is underlined in the different colors as it is mixed to the concrete. But these are perhaps more formal analogies, let's say, between a quarry and the building, between the layering of the stones and the layering of the concrete construction. But perhaps on a more conceptual level, I would like to show 2 or 3 examples. The first is a little house in Italy, again by Herzog de Meuron, a house which was built in this old terrain with these stone walls, and you can see that the construction of the dry stones is reintroduced in the construction of the building, which has, as you can see, a very clear concrete frame. So a ruin is transformed into a building, and the building will probably fall into a ruin again. But this is not the point. The point is somehow that you have here 2 materials which are brought together, iron and minerals, in the concrete, which is, of course, a reinforced concrete. So you have the metal elements and the concrete elements. But the stone itself is a stone which is full of metal. So somehow you can see that the same materials are used somehow in 2 completely different states. The one in a modern state where the different elements are separated. You have iron and you have minerals which are brought together to form a concrete beam. And the other somehow the primitive state where the stone is still having its metal. So it's ferroconcrete stone combined with ferro cement, if you want. Similarly, in the house of in the so-called White House of Valerio Olgiati, a transformation of a traditional house in the village of in a small village in Switzerland, where he would strip the whole building from its plaster. He would reinforce the ceiling by putting a cornice in concrete, and he will open regular windows, or he will introduce regular openings into the facade and close the balconies or the main door. But by painting again the whole building in white, somehow these different temporalities of the building will be pushed out, and instead somehow of a historical reading of this building, you have a material or a materialist reading of it through their surface. What is at stake is the surface, not anymore the history. He's not such interested in history. What is at stake somehow are the different surfaces. And there is a beautiful inside photo with a tree. I was thinking of you, Professor Liu. From the interior, you have a tree structure, but I didn't show it because it would have broken my narrative. So sorry for that. I was hesitating to put it into it, to have the rain and the tree at least inside the building. Another beautiful building, I think, which also deals with this, what I call this natural history, is the Brother Klaus Chapel in Germany by Peter Zumthor, where the rammed earth is built around a wooden structure that you can see here. And this wooden structure is then, or the wooden scaffolding somehow, is then burned down, leaving its traces, but also giving the solidity to the building. And here again, we see how this in interest in the materials and in the potential of this material finds its realization. Perhaps on a territorial level, I would like to show two other projects. So we had formal levels, we had the levels of the object and the conceptual level, and now on the perhaps more territorial level. Quickly, the thermal bath in Wals from Peter Zumthor that uses this local stone that is layered like in the quarry. But what is perhaps more interesting is the way Peter Zumthor describes it. He says that the building should seem older than the landscape. So again, we have here this strong engagement between the building and the territory. The building somehow should integrate itself within a longer history of nature. And similarly, when Herzog de Meuron proposes this project here for Tenerife, they similarly engage with the building of an artificial topography. And here again, Jacques Herzog has a very interesting way of describing it, saying we as architects have the same challenges like the painter. Our goal somehow is to design something that reflects nature but simultaneously remains autonomous. So again, here is this very strong interest in trying to bring together the shapes of nature and the shapes of the building. Having said this, I would like somehow to draw a general conclusion and especially somehow to textualize perhaps, or to describe perhaps a more general shift that seems to happen, and perhaps that seems also to reflect a completely new relationship between architecture and topography that seems to be so central within the Swiss history, the relation between the man-made and the natural. There seems to be two options that could be followed. One option, either the whole environment, the built and the non-built, is to be considered as natural, as we as humans are, of course, part of nature. So this seems to be one possible option to be, that we ourselves consider to be part of this bigger thing which is nature. We are also part and dependent somehow on the laws of physics. And this would encompass the man-made and the non-man-made in a similar way. The second option is to conceive the environment as a human construction, totally, a total artificial landscape. Because from the moment on, somehow, we look at the landscape, we conceive it and we construct it as something human. This seems somehow to be the two possible poles of action that are at stake, at least in this early 2010s or a little bit later even. And I would like somehow to show two possible paths that have been followed. The first is by a landscape architect, Christophe Giraud, who was also teaching in our school, who made a proposal for the Rhone Valley. The Rhone Valley would be a whole lecture in itself. It's a valley which has a very strong alpine river, and through the last 200 years, it had already 3 different corrections, and again, the river would not respect somehow the man-made canal. And so Giraud proposes somehow to play with the forces of the river and leaving outside the cities, somehow controlling very much the river within the urban cityscape, as you can see here, while on the other parts where the agricultural lands are, to allow the water in case of higher waters, to allow them somehow to flow over the river. So how the river and the valley is conceived as a reaction somehow to the forces of the river. The other option seems to be more present in several other projects like these by Marcel Meili. This is the same author who wrote the text in relation to Aldo Rossi, and I think this is also important, who they were asked